let me first start out by welcoming all of our guests to the United States Naval Academy. We're thrilled you're here, and also the faculty, the students who have accompanied them. To the midshipmen organizers, I'd like to just give a quick shout out to them because this is a midshipman, a student-run conference, and they do all of this hard work in addition to all the other responsibilities they have. To the midshipmen who were not organizers, I know why you're here. You're here because you don't have to go to class. True? Sure, of course, acknowledged. Anyhow, I'm delighted you're here, and I want to start off the conference in a positive note. This is all about sharing of ideas. The last thing we want to do is have a panel lecturing to you about their ideas. We want to engage the questions and curiosities that you have on a significant topic. There are no shortage of crises in the world. What's recently happened, unfortunately, in Haiti is a perfect example that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. I have had and dealt with my share of crises in my 30-year Navy career, and we have established and organized a panel that has unlimited experience across a diverse set of skill sets. So what I'm going to do is just briefly introduce our four panelists. Their bios are in your program, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the details of their significant accomplishments. To my left is retired Rear Admiral Marsha Evans, and if you read in her bio, she spent 30 years in the United States Navy and has had a significant number of high-level positions, including both the American Red Cross and is currently the acting director of the LPGA. To her left is Dr. Sternlicht, and he is an emergency room attending physician, and he currently heads that ER department at the Baltimore Medical Center, the Greater Baltimore Medical Center. To my right is Captain Brent Jett, retired U.S. Navy, and I might mention as part of my introduction, he's been a friend of mine for over 30 years. We're both classmates of this institution, the United States Naval Academy. He finished a little higher than I did in my class. I just like to brag, but he finished first in my class, which means I was second or better. But anyhow, Brent has spent a career not only operationally flying in the Navy, but spent the latter part of his career at NASA, a veteran of 4 shuttle missions, 2 in which he commanded. And to his right is Captain Shoshana Chatfield. She's an active duty Navy captain, naval aviator, helicopter pilot, and she's en route to command out the West Coast in San Diego. So as you can well imagine, we have lots of experience across a wide spectrum of issues involving crisis, not only humanitarian assistance, matters of warfare, matters of the environment, matters of health and the health sciences. So I think this will be rich for discussion. The way we're going to proceed is this. I'm going to give each of the panelists about 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes, it's their discretion, to sort of briefly introduce their area of expertise and perhaps comment briefly on their thoughts about leadership, the nexus of leadership and preparing for crisis. There's certainly no question that how we prepare for crisis, how we develop our own individual leadership and the leadership within our organizations will directly translate and manifest into how successful we are when the crises occur. That seems simple. The harder question is, how do we do it? And that's what I want you to engage the panelists are. So I'll give each of them about 5 to 7 minutes. We'll go starting with Admiral Evans, and we'll give each of them just a brief introduction. And as they are talking and as you are reviewing their bios, what I'd like you to consider are some questions you'd like to engage them on. So as we reach the end, the rest of the session is going to be a dialogue between you, the conference participants, and these panelists. So what we will do is when they're finished, I will invite you to start moving forward, either left or right, to the microphones, and you can address a question specifically to one of the panelists or broadly to all of the panelists, and then I will moderate the conversation. Sound fair? And if you don't engage, I'm perfectly comfortable getting up out of my seat and coming and finding you, all right? So I know you will. And some of my students are out there, so I know they won't let me down. All right, So Admiral Evans, thanks again for coming, and please.
A couple of things to start with. First of all, my service as the acting commissioner of ladies golf ended on January 3rd. That was an organization in crisis, and so many of the things that Mr. George commented on really resonated with me about changing cultures of organizations and so on. The second point I would make, it's an honor to be here, to be invited to be here today. I was stationed in many locations in my Navy career, twice here at the U.S. Naval Academy, once as 5th Battalion officer and once as the Chief of Staff. I always used to say my favorite duty station was the one where I was at the time the question was asked, but I'll tell you all, two of my favorite duty stations were the two tours I had here. Let me start out by making a distinction between crisis leadership and crisis management, because I think there is importance there. The plans, when I talk about crisis management, I'm talking about the plans and processes to respond to crisis that can be developed over time, that can be tested and exercised, and then further refined. The best organizations learn. They don't fall into the rut of preparing for exactly the last crisis, the one that they've just been through. Their leaders focus on the lessons learned from other crises, their own, the ones they've been through, as well as others, and they improve crisis response time and the actual management of the operation. Organizations can shorten the time between the onset of the crisis and the initial response, as well as the quality and the management of that response. It takes leaders and managers who are not satisfied with the status quo, who are always challenging the system and the extraordinary bureaucracies that build up in the crisis management, crisis leadership business. Well, after the historic and very challenging 2004 hurricane season, the Red Cross improved significantly disaster response systems. And we planned for and exercised scenarios involving between 5 and 7 times the scale and scope of what we had experienced in the historic 2004 season. We expanded stocks and we moved warehoused supplies closer to the areas where hurricanes might strike. We invested in more and advanced technology, emergency communications capabilities. We strengthened our partnership with FedEx, who also helped us move supplies. We strengthened our partnership with FEMA, and we implored the mayor and the city leadership of New Orleans to develop that city's emergency evacuation plans. Well, as leaders, we become very good at preparing for the expected, and we fall into routines. We believe we know what to expect, and we prepare our team to respond to that. It's critical for us all to appreciate the differences between the crisis we prepare for and the truly unforeseen, the low probability but very high impact events that may even threaten the viability of the organization. And unquestionably, these events often present career-defining moments. No organization can prepare for every crisis event. It would be an impossible task, and it would be a tremendous misappropriation of financial and human resources to try to prepare for every possible event. It is also impossible to imagine every scenario that might unfold. Who could have imagined that Katrina, Rita, Wilma, that sequence of hurricanes in the summer of '05 would be 15 to 20 times larger than any previous U.S. domestic disaster response, that a major American city would be evacuated, that more than 3 million people would depend on the American Red Cross for substantial financial aid, and that emergency shelters would need to be opened in 27 states and the District of Columbia, that FEMA would totally fail in its mission, and the Red Cross would not have an effective partner. No matter how all-encompassing the organization's crisis management plan is, when the crisis happens, it needs leadership. Someone who has the authenticity and influence to lead not only those in the direct chain of command, but also who can earn the trust and connect emotionally with stakeholders and onlookers, and for the American Red Cross, for potential donors. My short list of the most important qualities of effective leaders in crisis includes commitment, perseverance, and strong values. The courage to act in the face of fear and significant uncertainty. The ability to cope with change and to adapt to dramatic changes of circumstances, real-time changes. Excellent communication skills to communicate the vision and clear direction, to inspire followers, to allay fears, and reassure outside participants and onlookers. Decisiveness, the ability to make decisions without having all the information, make those decisions rapidly and intuitively, and more often than not, to be right. And finally, experience, previous experience in tough and challenging situations. After the dust settles, it's extremely important to review every aspect of the operations, including the leadership, from preparation right through to conclusion. That's what being an accountable leader is all about. Post-event reviews are one of the most important ways insights are gleaned and improvements can be made to prepare for future operations. But it can be very tough on an organization. Everyone is fueled by adrenaline during the crisis. In the heat of the moment, everyone is trying their hardest, doing their best. But afterwards, when everyone is dead tired, how do you accomplish the clear-headed, self-critical, honest evaluation? How do you re-energize the team to be as focused and enthusiastic about the review and implement the needed changes? How do you transition out members of the team who tried hard, who did their very best, but may not quite have measured up? After the operation is over is when there's extensive, I underscore extensive, Monday morning quarterbacking by people who weren't even engaged in any aspect of the operation. And in some cases, the Monday morning quarterbacks were people who actually hindered forward progress during the crisis response. Well, what's the answer to that? I think it's for the leader to embrace the evaluation process and share the results, that transparency that Mr. George talked about, and even start that evaluation process well before the operation is even over. In effect, to beat them to the punch. It's all about the leader's commitment to continuous improvement, including improvements in leaders' own effectiveness. I believe the majority of leaders who weathered the storm of crises can cite earlier intense transformational experiences. I know I did. I was the senior officer on scene when the San Francisco earthquake happened. I was on Treasure Island. The bridge fell down. The boss, the commander that I was working for, was at the Giants at the World Series game, and all of a sudden, I was the director of the Navy response during that earthquake. In the middle of the night, the city of South San Francisco asked us to send a Navy ship over. The city was dark, totally blacked out. Asked us to send a Navy ship over, a frigate, to provide some power to restart the city's generators. I was in San Francisco. I got a call from the chief of staff from our commander, Surface Forces Pacific Fleet. The chief of staff, who was quite senior to me, I was a very junior, I was a frocked captain at the time, called me and said, "Don't do it, it will never work." So here I am in San Francisco, 400 plus miles away, my boss's chief of staff telling me not to send this ship over. So what to do? So I swallowed hard, I thanked him for the advice. Make a long story short, we sent the ship over. The connection was made, the ship provided power, started up the emergency generator, restarted the power plants for the city of South San Francisco, and the lights came back on that night. Well, that wasn't really the story. I think what was the most important part of the story was about 3 days later when the runways were repaired at Alameda and the commander of the surface forces could come to San Francisco. He flew up, and the first thing he did was gather all of the team together at the staff there at Treasure Island and publicly apologized for the errors that his staff had made in getting in the way of what was clearly something that the Navy had to do for, if for nothing else, for partnership and collaboration purposes with the city of South San Francisco. So it had a good ending, and I will tell you, for me, it was truly a transforming experience, and particularly when the three-star boss came up and helped us all understand what appropriate support is during situations like that. We have no way of knowing when we're going to be thrust into a leadership role in a crisis. It can be positive, it can also be paralyzing. It can come in the form of a career or leadership opportunity. or a relationship, or an event like an earthquake, or a hurricane, or a tsunami, or a terrorist attack. Are we prepared for these unpredictable times? Being prepared is at the crux. What you do every day to prepare, especially on those days between the crises, to build a team, to train, to build relationships inside, across, and outside the organization, to improve your capabilities to lead by striving for excellence, and develop confidence in yourself to take on and succeed in the tough jobs. That's what gets you, and more importantly, that's what gets your organization through the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Sternlicht?
Good morning. My background is, I'm an emergency physician by training. I did my training actually at Eastern Virginia Medical School in Norfolk, Virginia, 1994 to 1998. And a fair amount of my training was actually at Portsmouth Naval Hospital as well, so I do have some experience down there, where we sort of shared training programs. They came to us and we went to them and so forth. By nature of my profession, emergency medicine, it's on a day-to-day basis, clinically, what I have to deal with is I have to expect the worst, not the most likely. So every time I see a patient and they have a complaint, I have to assume which one of these, what's going to kill them, and what's going to kill them quickly or later, and work myself down those complaints to the more likely. Because if I go by more likely, I'm going to be burned. So by nature of my profession, I'm always expecting the worst. Why I'm here today is I'm also, my other role is medical director of emergency preparedness at my hospital. I have a pretty big hospital in suburban Baltimore County, Maryland, and our emergency department sees about 62,000 patients per year. Some of the most surgeries in the state of Maryland occur there. And I realized back in around 2002, 2003, that I felt we had some huge opportunities in emergency preparedness as far as disaster preparedness. I realized this in a combination of a few things. Obviously, there was September 11th, and I said to myself that day, well, what would we do if this happened here in Baltimore? And not too long after that was the SARS pandemic up in Canada and in Asia, and I thought about how taxing all these things are on an already overburdened healthcare system. And I said, are we ready? And in my mind, we were far from ready. So I got involved in the emergency preparedness efforts at my hospital and formed the Emergency Preparedness Committee, and I started that in late 2003, early 2004. And we pretty much had to start from scratch, because we honestly were not ready for any of those things as well as some other things that we learned about over the last 5 or 6 years that were happening. So we got the committee together, we had to get the right people involved, and we had to develop structure and a plan. Fortunately, over the course of a couple of years, we did get the right people at the table, and we started planning and saying, so what are we going to do? First thing we needed was some, as I said, structure. So we adopted the hospital incident command system. It's called HICS. It's a command system in which all hospitals can have common language and command and control, communication, etc., and hospitals within the hospitals and in between hospitals, so we're all on the same page. And this was a mandate by the president in 2003. And basically from there, we developed the hospital incident command system, and we got involved in the community, and I was a member of the Baltimore County Task Force, which is a group of all different hospitals, EMS, and other healthcare, public health, and we sort of planned as a community together to be ready for the next crisis and so forth. So we built up on that over the years, and one of the big things we always talked about, not highly likely, but something that can occur would be the next pandemic. And our concerns were there was the 1918 pandemic, which...
Is this any better? Thank you. Sorry, I didn't realize I was off.
We were prepared for the crisis.
All right, well, I'm glad that's better now. So we were preparing for a pandemic, and we said it happened in 1918, it happened in 1957, it happened in 1968, We had this H5N1, which was going on in Asia and Africa. We're watching it. And this is this flu, the bird flu, that's transmissible from birds to humans, but not really going human to human. But knowing science, we said, this is going to come to us one day. When? We don't know. Is it going to be 2 years? Is it going to be 5 years? Is it going to be 10 years? I don't know, but it will. So that was really very high on our preparedness list, was for the next pandemic. And we started this in around 2004, 2005. And we started doing drills, because the challenges in healthcare are, there's really not much built-in surge. Emergency departments throughout the country, and particularly urban emergency departments, suburban emergency departments, are pretty much at the breaking point already. We're at capacity, hospitals at capacity. So what are you going to deal with a 10%, a 20%, a 50%, a 200% surge in patients? It's tough. The second challenge you have with a pandemic is you worry about your staff. What you don't want happening is your frontline staff, who are going to be the people exposed to these illnesses, getting sick and losing, just being out of commission. And in 1957, 30 to 50% of all the staff during that flu were out sick because they all caught the flu. So you worry about that. Next thing you worry about is how you're going to protect your patients. When you have a highly infectious illness such as flu, which is actually transmissible before you even have symptoms, so a doctor or a nurse could be transmitting the virus before they even know they're sick. You're dealing with the spread of to patients, so you'll have a flu patient, you get sick, and then a cancer patient comes in, you don't want to spread it to a cancer patient. So these are all real life scenarios we had to worry about. So over the years, we planned, we did drills, we did training exercise, we purchased equipment. Some equipment which we purchased were surge capacity tents. Basically what we learned from Katrina and Rita, we learned a lot of things from that, and we built it into our own preparedness plans, was some of these hospitals built portable hospitals outside their hospitals. So we purchased a portable hospital, a tent, a self-contained tent to see patients in, which was heating, air conditioned, negative pressure, etc. So we said, what are we going to do if we get this flu and we don't have space and we want to segregate all the patients who have flu, keep them away from all the non-flu patients that are going to continue to come in. So we did drills and training exercises with these tents. We did drills and training exercises immunizing our staff members. We said, if there's a flu and we have to immunize people quickly, how are we going to do that? Because that's one of your greatest defenses. Unfortunately, it takes about 6 or 12 months till you get there, even have the flu vaccine. But we said when we have it, we need to know how to vaccinate people quickly. So we did drills on that over the years. And then, sure enough, last spring, next thing we're hearing, I wouldn't have predicted it, and I don't think anybody in my hospital predicted it, we had this new virus out there, H1N1. It wasn't the H5N1 that we were expecting, but here we had this virus which was very, very transmissible, person to person, a lot of people getting sick. The initial thoughts on this were it could be really virulent, and we were really worried about how sick people were going to get. Retrospectively, fortunately, people didn't get that sick with this, but as far as numbers went, there were a lot of people got sick. So we had to pretty much very quickly put all these plans and training exercises we did into action last spring. We had the right base, we had the right committee, we had all the right people immediately at the table, which wouldn't have been there 5 years ago. Then we had our disaster plan already. We all knew it because we all drilled on it, we all practiced it. The Hicks plan, we put up our Hicks diagram so we knew whose roles are, we assigned roles. We did this all spring, we did this all fall, and then we really made a big decision that we had talked about this October is, okay, our volumes are above capacity, what are we going to do now? So we started those tents, and we put the tents up, and we started seeing patients in tents, which maybe not that different than people are exposed to in the military, but in a community hospital in Baltimore County, it was a different thing to do. We were nervous about it, but we said we had to do it. And we saw our volumes increased. We were seeing a typical day for us in October is 160, 165 patients. We had days 240, 245. So we were seeing 60, 80 more patients than we normally do on some days. And it was the tents that let us be able to take care of these patients appropriately. So it was a challenge. One thing I learned, and this is something that I've always done in my leadership positions, I've been chairman of my emergency department for about 2.5 years now. And a big principle of mine is never tell somebody what to do if I can't do it myself. So the first day the tent opened, I went out there clinically. I opened up the tent. I was the first doctor in the tent. We weren't sure if it was going to work in real life, but we saw patients through that tent. We set it up. We stopped it. We saw several patients through these tents. I was the first doctor. I stayed there for 18 hours that day, seeing patients, moving through, working out the bugs. We had some bugs, but we realized it worked. We had those tents open the entire month of October. It got us through the pandemic. And we saw more patients than we ever have in the month of October, in a month that we've ever seen in my emergency department. And what was really interesting is when we looked at our statistics retrospectively, not only did we see more patients than we ever had, we had the fewest patients leaving without an evaluation by percent. And our patient satisfaction scores were in the 90th percentile nationally. And we were probably one of the only people who actually used tents. And we thought patients may not like it, but they loved it because we had the operation so efficient, and it worked out real well. So that was my most recent and one of my bigger crises. And I really learned a lot because for years and years we kept on saying, it's when, it's not if. And we weren't expecting this to happen in 2009, 2010, but it happened. And because we were so prepared, things, we made mistakes, we learned a lot of things, but overall, I couldn't have been happier with the results as far as how we were able to get through these surge of patients and all our non-flu patients, our chest pains, our strokes, our traumas, we're all able to get taken care of quickly and not got lost in the 50 to 60 extra flu patients we're seeing a day, which always makes it a challenge when you're trying to triage people. So that's pretty much my background.
Thank you, Dr. Sternlicht. We have heard about disaster relief services, the healthcare field, the medical profession. I'm now going to ask Captain Jett to talk about his profession, NASA.
Thanks, Captain Adamshick. It's really an honor to be part of this panel. Understanding crisis leadership and how to prepare for it is an extremely important topic and one that you can never stop learning about. So I expect to learn as much here as I impart any of my experiences to you all. If you watch the news, the term crisis is used quite a bit. We have a housing crisis, we have an economic crisis, we have a financial crisis. Within the NASA human spaceflight program, crisis has a very specific meaning. If you ask anyone at NASA involved with spaceflight and ask them what is a crisis, they'll probably answer Apollo 13, Challenger, Columbia, and some will also include the Apollo 1 fire. So it's a very, very specific, has a very specific meaning to all of us involved in human spaceflight. In 1992, about 18 years ago, when I received orders to report to the Johnson Space Center, I left a fighter squadron. At the time, I wasn't flying with Captain Adamshick, but I was based at Oceana, flying F-14s off of aircraft carriers. And going to the human spaceflight program was quite a transition. And let me use my few minutes here to just talk about two aspects of preparing for crisis and how NASA deals with it. To give you an idea of what that transition was like, as a fighter pilot, we would spend some amount of time preparing for emergencies, and we'd do an emergency simulator once a year, and we'd have systems briefings, and we had mishap plans. But we spent the majority of our time training on tactics to project air power and air superiority. When I got to NASA, I quickly learned the ratio was almost totally inverted. In the human spaceflight business, as we prepare for a mission, I would estimate we spend 50 to 60% of our time training for the save the crew and the vehicle scenario. The big, I've got a lot of things going wrong, multiple problems, and we have to save the crew and get them home, and hopefully bring the vehicle home as well. We spend about 20 to 30% of our time on what I would consider save the mission type scenarios. And that's where you've got problems. It's maybe not life-threatening to the crew, but you could lose the mission. And so we train both the astronaut crews and the flight control teams on the ground how to deal with those situations. And finally, that leaves about 10, maybe 20% of our time to actually train how we actually think we're going to execute the mission, with maybe one or two small problems that typically pop up. So there's definitely a different focus at NASA in terms of how we train for human spaceflight missions and our perception of preventing the crisis. We put a lot of effort into hoping to prevent it. We probably don't do as much as we could in terms of preparing for what happens when we fail and we don't prevent the crisis. We have contingency plans, we have mishap plans, we have rapid response teams, we drill them. If you've ever get to see what goes on behind the scenes of a shuttle launch, we pre-position a tremendous number of forces, search and rescue forces, along the trajectory of the shuttle. So we do what we think we can, but it really doesn't prepare you for when the crisis actually happens. Now, I wasn't at NASA for obviously for Apollo 13 or Apollo 1 or even Challenger. However, I was there during the Columbia breakup. And it was February 2003. I was actually assigned to a shuttle mission as a commander. We weren't on deck, we were in the hole, so to speak, to use baseball terminology. We were the second crew in line after Columbia. I believe it was a Saturday morning, and it was pretty much, caught us by surprise. We never really expected entry to be the time when we would lose a crew. Most of our focus was on the ascent to orbit. The vehicle broke up over Texas. Debris rained down all over the piney woods of East Texas, towns of Lufkin, Hemp Hill, Jasper, some of the other areas. Very quickly, we started getting calls, and it wasn't just debris that was coming down. The vehicle broke apart at around Mach 20 and 200,000 feet, right at the point of peak heating during entry. And the astronauts, we did have a recovery of human remains effort that needed to be put in place. Several of us got in our cars and we drove without any real direction. We got in our cars and we drove up to Lufkin because most of the reports that were coming in through the FBI seemed to be centered on that area. To make a long story short, over the next weeks and months, there were 10, 20 different federal agencies involved in the recovery effort. FBI, all the law enforcement agencies you can think of. We had medical teams. We had dog teams in. I remember in the early days, it was primarily chaos, and when all these different agencies would get to, everybody would show up in a room, and they turned around to the guy wearing the NASA blue flight jacket, which happened to be me, and say, okay, what do we do? So rather than go through in detail what we did, I would just like to share about 4 or 5 things that I learned from that experience in the recovery effort for the astronauts and for the debris of the vehicle. First, contingency plans are only plans. Any leader who expects to go into a crisis and be able to follow that plan, it's not going to work. So if that is the case, what do you do? And that brings me to my second point, it's extremely important for the leaders to understand the core principles behind the contingency and the crisis that's in place. So what are the most important things to your organization in terms of responding to the crisis? You need to keep those things in mind and know that priority. The third point I would make is that checklists that are in your contingency action plan are great, but really we didn't use them in terms as a prescriptive method. We reviewed checklists to see if we were forgetting anything. We really relied on going back to what we knew were the priorities in terms of the crisis, making decisions appropriately, and then sort of reviewing the checklist and saying, hey, are we forgetting anything? And then adding that into our daily plan. Finally, communication is extremely important in a crisis. That's one thing you can, I believe, have a good plan for. Have a communication plan, have a backup, and have a backup to that. But communication is a two-edged sword, especially if you're in a very sort of public type crisis, and it's getting a lot of media attention. So in those plans, be sure that you understand who should get what information, and that needs to be crystal clear. And finally, I'll close with the last point is you need to have some flexibility in your command structure in a crisis. While we can train and try to prepare leaders to manage and lead in times of crisis. Crisis often finds leaders, and you need to be able to identify those people who have that leadership capability and put them in charge. That's it.
All right, thank you very much. It was interesting as I was listening to Brent speak, I was looking at Captain Chatfield, and she's an operational helicopter pilot, and everything he was saying, she was nodding her head up and down, because as an operational aviator, as a warrior, as opposed to a researcher, there wasn't much that wasn't directly relatable to our field, which is naval aviation. So I'd like to give you a few moments to offer your thoughts on the subject.
Am I on? Am I
Yes.
on? Okay. Well, it's always kind of nice to bat sweep up, and I want to thank the panel. I'm honored to be up here and share the table with them because their experiences are really just awesome if you think about it. And we do want to talk about the operational side of crisis planning all the time. You know, I know what to do, I can get in there and I can do it, my team can do it. I can't tell you how many times as a department head or an operational squadron commander, I picked up the phone and some poor, sleep-deprived operations center watch officer screamed into the phone, how many helicopters do you have and where are they? And that's the way it happens. There's this respond mentality, and it's fast, and you have got to respond. And when does it happen? It happens at the worst possible time. I was on Guam when the Indonesian tsunami happened. It happened, of course, while the commanding officer of the squadron was in the United States. I was the executive officer. The CO is 18 hours away by air, and we're going to put detachments to sea on ships to respond to a tsunami. For how long, we don't know. So what do you need to do when faced with things like that? We can talk about that all day long because these crises are not going to stop. And we are expeditionary, and we are going to respond. So I'll take any questions about that you might have when it's your turn to talk. But what we haven't talked about up here so far is the impact on people of crisis. And that's a big part of naval leadership. It's a big part of organizational leadership. And I want to take just a moment so that we don't miss that huge topic as we go into your questions. Now, how many of you read the Navy Times in the room? Okay. Well, periodically, reporting occurs on units that have experienced a crisis in the crew. Either that's the loss of a shipmate, it's the removal of a commanding officer, it's a failure of an inspection. And this is also a crisis because it attacks the confidence of the crew and their ability to do the mission. And it's really hard to go in and find out what needs to be done, especially when people have been working as hard as they can work for as long as they can work and have been failing. And I want you to think about that as a kind of crisis that you may have to deal with as a military leader. That something has gone wrong, and you've got to get to the bottom of it. And how do you do it? How do you go in when you don't know who to trust? How do you establish trust? How do you communicate your expectations? And how do you receive feedback so that you get a clear picture of what's going on? These are very, very hard dilemmas in leadership when there is succession that is particularly unplanned or as happens as a result of a crisis. So that's one thing that I want you to have in the back of your mind, is that taking command in crisis, leadership crisis, deals a lot about trust. Who to trust, how to establish trust, and how to communicate those expectations. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we always think of these crises about how rapidly we can deploy relief, how rapidly we can respond. And I'll tell you, when we were spinning up our last detachment to send them off to Indonesia, I pulled the crew in, and they were raring to go. You could see the adrenaline. They were raring to go. And I told them, this is not a sprint. This is an endurance race. They're going to be starting 1 week from now, 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, and 4 weeks from now. So when you're looking at how you respond, you have to look at what you have, how long you have it, and what the cost is in terms of what else you can't do, and how long your people can sustain that momentum. Now, we have very, very strict regulations on that in naval aviation. How many hours can you fly in a month? And you have a flight surgeon that can waive that. We set up a process for feedback from our deployed personnel so that we could actually monitor their stamina to continue to fly at that pace. And these are things that you have to think about. And then I want to talk to you about one last issue, and that is the impact of people who are crisis responders in dealing with extreme human tragedy. I did not realize how buried the effect was on people until I was training for my last mission, which was as a provincial reconstruction team commander in Afghanistan. And I was working with a lot of reservists and a lot of National Guardsmen. In particular, I had an administrative petty officer who was in the reserves, a wonderful, wonderful woman. And we had as an exercise how we were going to handle a death among our crew. Now, 4 of the 12 provincial reconstruction teams out there the year that I was there did lose people among their crew in the performance of their mission. And so thinking about how you're going to deal with loss of life in your command is extremely important. And I noticed that she was not doing well. So I waited until I could get her into an isolated place, and I said, well, what's really going on? Because I was caught up in what it meant for me to make notification of families and to write the letter and to handle the remains in a dignified way. And she burst into tears. And she said, when I send out the message, it means he's really dead. I viewed that as an administrative task. And I had overlooked the impact of it on her and her life. And so we ask people to go and do things. I've asked rescue swimmers to jump in the water and recover dead people. I've transported bodies. And there is an impact on your crew. There's an impact on people. It affects how they are able to do their job and how they are able to do their job in the long term. So let's not get always caught up in the rapid deployment of our materials in our thinking about crisis response. Don't forget about the human side and the communication of the mission, the importance of the mission, and the importance of sustaining personal readiness to do the mission. Thanks.
I told you it was an impressive panel, and I didn't let you down, no doubt. I want you to consider a couple things as you, the participants, start moving forward to ask your questions. So as you want to get up, don't be bashful, but consider a couple things. First of all, what the panelists have discussed are crises of, if not national, global significance and consequence. I mean, there's no doubt that Katrina and Columbia and the tsunami are of national significance. And for you young undergraduate students, that may be beyond the stretch or realm of your imagination. I want you to now bring this back down and contextualize it in terms of your life. The crises that you face as students, the crises that you will face as you transition professionally, the crises you may face at home or in your personal lives. That's one thing. We're focusing on leader behavior, leader attributes that allow us to be best prepared. The second thing I want you to consider is ask questions about not only the leadership attributes that lead to great crisis management and great leadership acumen in crisis, but what are those leadership qualities that maybe prevent progress and success in crises? Because for every crisis I've been in, not only did I focus on attributes that were exceptional, but we all know people who don't do so well in crises. So those are some questions that you might be able to probe the panelists on, okay? So don't be bashful. Don't come up and ask them to tell more sea stories. Try to contextualize it as it relates to you and your leader development trajectory. That's the purpose. This is for you. So I encourage you now to perhaps start moving forward, and don't be bashful. They're here and eager to answer your questions. I'd like to see lots of movement. Thank you, young lady. And if you would, when you get to the microphone, please identify, of course, your name, but tell us where you're from, so if we've beaten you in a sport, we can make fun of you.
My name is Anthony Miller. I'm from American University in the School of Public Affairs Leadership Program. My question is really to all the panelists, because what you guys talked about is we're talking about preparing for leadership, but as a leader, you also have a responsibility to help those you're leading to grow. One panelist said that you got to be a little bit flexible with your plans. Your checklist is more something as a reference material. Somebody else said that you can prepare, but you can't prepare for everything. So what I'm kind of asking is, where's the balance that you guys draw in preparing for too much, but still at the same time allowing those you're leading to grow?
That's a great question, and the question is, and I hope all of you heard it, is, when you're in a crisis, you're focused on the crisis, but you also have to train your replacement, because you are our replacements. So perhaps since Admiral Evans went first and hasn't had a chance to contribute, I saw you nodding your head, so would you mind responding first?
That is a fabulous question. Way back in the 80s, I was the executive officer of a boot camp, and back in those days, there were no cell phone. The cell phone was like a gigantic piece of equipment, and real people didn't have them. So the commanding officer called me in, and he said, "I'm going to take a 2 weeks of leave, and I'm going to go on a trip through the national parks, and I'll call in every couple of days to just to kind of, check in with you. So I thought, well, how can he go away for 2 weeks and only check in once in a while? And we were a 24/7 kind of operation. The boot camp trained about 25,000 recruits a year, and it really was, something was happening every day. And sure enough, he drives away over the horizon, and the first crisis happens. So the wife of a chief petty officer, fabulous petty officer, needed a liver transplant, and in those days, liver transplants were not approved for the military health insurance and health system, but she was going to die if she didn't get a liver transplant. The second thing that happened was a recruit jumped off the roof of one of the training buildings and didn't pass away, but was seriously injured. And it was kind of like that. And sure enough, so it was like a crisis every hour, it seemed to me. Sure enough, great team there, handled everything. We got a liver transplant for the wife. We helped the family deal with the recruit that, by virtue of his suicidal tendencies, was going to be sent home. And a whole lot of other things happened. And actually, we not only survived, but the command thrived. So I learned from that experience immensely. It was probably the single most growing experience I had to prepare me for the rest of my Navy career and then the subsequent career I've had. And I will tell you, every now and then I kind of have to remind myself to give my subordinates, in whether it was the Girl Scouts or the Red Cross or LPGA even, to give them that same opportunity to grow. I think you can bring along people in your organization, but until you actually trust them, until you actually give them that responsibility and let them try it out with your coaching and your mentoring, your feedback, they're really going to be incompletely developed to replace you. And of course, it came home pretty dramatically in my next assignment in San Francisco that, we don't often get to choose when the big crises are going to happen, and we have executive officers that are mobilizing, thank heavens, to respond to the tsunami, and we have other people who step up. But an important part of your responsibility, as that captain at the Recruit Training Command said, my job is to make sure you are ready whenever I'm not there and the command needs
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Okay, I'd like perhaps Captain Jett to just briefly respond, and then we'll move over to this side. Please, sir.
When I was your age, someone once told me a good leader decides, delegates, and disappears. The 3 Ds of leadership. And I thought about that as I went through my career, and I really don't think that's correct. I've sort of modified that philosophy, and I'm not a Marine, but I like to keep things simple like Marines, so I have like little acronyms and things. So I have 2 Ds and 2 Es instead of 3 Ds, and my 2 Ds are you really want to delegate decisions to the lowest possible level in your organization. So that's different than making all the decisions yourself, and I think that's extremely important in developing the next set of leaders and the people to follow you. The 2 E's that I remind myself are, you want to delegate those decisions, but then you want to, you don't disappear, you stay around and you evaluate how your people are doing, and you try to elevate them. So you want to provide that mentoring relationship, let them go out on their own, but then give them honest feedback as to how they're doing, and give them whatever they need to elevate them to the next level of leadership.
Thank you very much. I like that you were standing at parade rest. I like that. We have a young man in a nice golf shirt, not in a uniform, standing at parade rest. That's very impressive. Very good. I'm sorry to tease you. I just want to keep it light. Please, go ahead. Flip the switch there.
Oh, it's fine, sir. I actually commissioned for 3 months, so I'm kind of used to it. But I'm Midshipman First Class Zachary George from Auburn University, RTC. And I think one of the big things with leadership in crisis is to control the crisis. You have to provide that control as the leader. And as you see, as recent events have occurred in the last 5-10 years, we've had a lot of crises, be it September 11th, be it the Hurricane Katrina, and now the Haiti situation. But I'm surprised to see the Haiti situation, unlike what you had in September 11th or Katrina, is you had a lot of chaos before you had control, and that control came in a decisive leader that set the tone. Whether it was Rudolph Giuliani in New York or Lieutenant General Honore stepping into the streets of New Orleans and providing that upfront in-your-face leadership. How important is that set the tone in-your-face leadership for a crisis situation instead of you can delegate to your subordinates, you can be your behind-the-scene manager, but that upfront, almost a General Patton, MacArthur type personality, how important is that to control the crisis?
I think it's a great question, and I'll ask the two end panelists if they'd consider, or one or the other, addressing it. I'm curious because so much of what we talked about has sort of this, at the foundation of it is this medical services component. And I would imagine, particularly in an emergency room, if there's an enormous triage and decisions having to be made, this whole notion of, okay, someone has to stand up and say, I'm the guy or I'm the gal and I'm in charge. Doctor, perhaps you might just offer a brief reflection on how you see that unfolding in your field?
Yes, I'd be happy to, if I get the mic working. Well, I think that's a great question, and the way I would answer that is, I think there are several different leadership tools and leadership styles, and I use personally several of them. In general, on a day-to-day operations basis, as far as being chairman of my emergency department, I'm a big democratic type of person. I'm chairman of a democratic group of physicians. Overall, telling people what to do would not serve me well. I have to get them, they're smart people I'm working with. Two of them are actually my prior chairman. One hired me 12 years ago, one I worked for 9 years. So I can't say you're doing it this way and then it's done. So in general, I let the group make the decision, and 99.9% of the time, when there's time, they're going to make the right decision. Then you have buy-in, and then you get the job done, and you don't have people who are on the sidelines trying to sabotage your efforts. But I think what you brought up is very important to during a crisis. A democratic leadership style during crisis is the wrong, in my opinion, the wrong leadership style. That's when people are looking for somebody to take command and make decisions. And sort of like with the H1N1 came to a head, we just had to make decisions quickly. Fortunately, several years had gone by and people realized that myself and my committee had the tools and we were going to make good decisions. So a lot of decisions were made in much more of a commanding style. We're doing it like this, and that's what people expected, and people went great with that because there was some opportunities before. And the same thing in an arrest situation in a hospital, or people really look at the charge doctor as the person who's going to make the decisions. If I have time, I listen to everybody on my team, the nurses, the techs, the transporters, everybody who works in the ER. But when there's a crisis, you got to just take control and bark out orders. But you have to give people the opportunity to be able to question you in a way that, because I've been saved several times by people on my team who didn't have that same ultimate responsibility.
Thank you very much. Did you want to offer your perspective? Probably different, perhaps? I don't know.
It's a bit different, and I want to caution you, Patton, about running in these days to various different corners of the world. And I want to give two examples. I'll take the example of Indonesia and the example of Pakistan. These are two governments that deal every day with insurgencies. And we have a very good CJTF package structure. All right, so when we talk about our U.S. forces and we talk about command and control, it's extremely important that we have a tight command and control structure. But it's also extremely important that we don't go into a sovereign nation and hand a public affairs victory to the enemy by demonstrating the inability of a host nation to care for its people. In those cases, partnering and supporting are two extremely important elements of the response. And you see that Pakistan asserts their sovereignty whenever they can. If they don't, that country is in extreme peril. Indonesia, when the immediate relief had been provided, asked international forces, military forces, to stand off. And it's those kinds of concerns that we have to be particularly observant and particularly careful to accommodate when we do our disaster response.
Thank you. This young lady over here, please.
My name is Stephanie Haven, Michigan Haven, from the Maritime Academy. My question is, what happens when you have multiple parties coming together, whether it's different agencies, different organizations, military groups? Initially I was thinking on the global scale, but as you were mentioning earlier, it could go down to something specific. And everyone each of them has their own ideas of preparedness and plans of action. What happens when they conflict and there's no one person or one leader to necessarily say we're going to do this or that, or what is the collaboration and not competition? What sort of courses can you take to get effect and relief carried out in a manner that everyone's contributing, but they might be coming from different areas or different ideas?
No, I think it's a great question. And again, remember the panel, this particular topic is about preparing. This question deals perhaps a little bit more specifically with the execution phase of leadership during a crisis. But nonetheless, we are an incredibly interagency type of government structure. The armed forces, as much as we endeavor to be joint and have similar doctrine and similar tactics, it's all about planning ahead of time, but it requires a lot of ahead of time type of cooperation. So any of the panelists want to respond to that question?
Well, the good news is that I think the compendium of mega disasters, mega responses has resulted in dramatically more pre-planning with respect to U.S. forces plus significant large-scale U.S. NGOs going in. Back in the 90s, it would have been unheard of for a relief organization like the Red Cross to work closely with the military services. By the time we got to the Asian tsunami, I was on the phone fairly regularly with people in the operations section of the JCS because we needed help moving large equipment and so on. And that was just a baby step. On the international scene, quite frankly, it's still very, very challenging because you have the UN in the wake of the tsunami recognize the opportunity and or responsibility, maybe both, to develop the UN capability to either through UNICEF, for example, because of so many children being impacted, or High Commissioner for Refugees. So that kind of compelled a little bit more forward thinking and at least conversations with the International Red Cross, the two different arms of the International Red Cross. One is to deal with situations involving humanitarian responses in the wake of conflict, and then the other part of the Red Cross, the Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, to develop more discrete and more effective plans for integrating the different Red Crosses. About 200 Red Cross societies around the world, Red Crescent societies, all want to show up at the same disaster, and it's unmitigated chaos. So they have been compelled to become better planners and think through what these crises might be. But I will tell you, there is still, in the NGO community, there is still real antipathy to cooperating with the military. It's, maybe it's in the DNA, but we in the American Red Cross thought that that was key and essential, but it was not an idea that was commonly shared by relief organizations. And then the last point I'll make, at the end of the day, I think it's the quality of the political leadership. And If you go back to Katrina, you could see a pretty dramatic difference in the recovery if you looked at Louisiana compared to Mississippi. And what was different in Louisiana, the political leadership basically broke down. It was Friday, that post-New Orleans flood week, before the governor of Louisiana embraced the idea of the federal government coming in. On the other hand, in Mississippi, the storm had barely gotten through, and Governor Haley Rogers was on the phone. What can the federal government bring, and how soon can the federal government get in there? Dramatically different political preparedness for the crisis. So in the end, in a democracy at least, it does truly depend on the leaders that we all elect.
Just if I might add a couple of things. The 9/11 Commission report speaks directly what Admiral Evans just discussed, which was interagency cooperation and collaboration. The CABE report, which discusses the Columbia mishap, does exactly the same thing. I would suspect after Haiti, since the initial response, at least in Haiti, was with NGOs, because we had very little, if any, military footprint down there, then all of a sudden, last week, we sent down a Marine task force with 2,000 Marines, so they had to go ashore and then figure out which NGOs and how they would collaborate and cooperate in order to provide services. There were a lot of relief supplies there, but the big issue was it was behind fences and they had no way to distribute it. So these matters of cooperation are significant. Finally, for those, Admiral Evans mentioned the term JTF. For those who may not understand, a JTF is a joint task force. And in the military, the joint means all of the services working together. And there's always a joint task force commander who's assigned. So it could be an Air Force officer who is the JTF with Marines, Army, Navy, all working for that single component commander. That is not the same in federal government or non-governmentals. It's a great question. Let's move over to here. Yes, sir.
Klein Moore from Louisiana State University in Shreveport. I would like to ask y'all, what would you think the most important aspect, characteristic of a leader would be needed to be effective in leadership during a crisis?
Okay, so you're talking specifically about an attribute of a leader, like handsome or tall?
Integrity.
Because I've got both of those. I'm not putting you on the spot. I think I know what you mean, right? Something that you can write down and say, this is what I did, or this is what I do exceptionally well, which makes me a leader who can be exceptional, which is what we want to be, exceptional leaders, either prior to a crisis or during a crisis. I'll let my colleagues to the right. Anybody want to respond? Anybody have a?
Yes. Well, I'll take a first stab at it. But I think it has to do with your ability to communicate and your ability to see how things could fit together. So it's actually a non-linear, complex problem. And so I think the best people that lead crisis responses are people who can see a variety of assets and how they can work best together to create synergies and be effective.
Please, Admiral Evans.
I would say moral courage, the courage to do the right thing when it's either confusing or people are telling you something else. It's the courage to do the right thing. That if I had to name one single quality.
Even though I'm not a panelist, I'll offer mine because I've had my share of crises. I have 3 teenagers at home, so I have crises every day. And I'm trying to think of the right adjective to describe it, but perhaps steady. I think the ones who I have served for, who have been the most exceptional leaders during time of crisis, and most of my crises have been either combat related, and combat is crisis with a capital C. Is that right? We spelled crisis with a C. Yeah, capital C. It's more like chaos. It's those who can remain steady. I admire anyone who, during times of crisis, is steady. And that means steady of the heart, steady of the mind, steady of that courage Admiral Evans is talking about, and doesn't get so wrapped up in the emotion. Crisis just makes us fall apart because of the emotion associated with. And this is something that you're not born with. You have to practice it. You have to habituate it, which means practice it every day. When you get that text message from your girlfriend and you think a crisis is brewing, be steady, young man. Be steady. All right. Over this side, the gentleman in that nice-looking tie. Please, sir.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
My name is Phil Carterell. I come from American University. And we've talked a lot about just working with local governments either in this nation or in other nations. And what I found a lot of the time is hostility even for any kind of aid from different organizations. So my question is, when you're preparing to go and help an area, how do you plan to deal with that hostility from the beginning?
Okay, so the question deals specifically with those who don't want help during a time of crisis. How do we articulate our altruism as opposed to some other ideological motivation, right? We're here to help, and oh, by the way, when we're done, we're going to occupy your country and take all your oil. Is that sort of the idea? For those who have dealt with matters, and this isn't just an international issue. I mean, I would imagine when Captain Jett was involved with the recovery of Colombia, there were a lot of local jurisdictions, state jurisdictions, who perhaps during that crisis certainly wanted their help. But do any of the panelists feel inclined to respond to, how do leaders sort of break through that initial reluctance for help?
Actually, I'm reminded by what Captain Chatfield said about the people involved. And that is when my experience has been that when you try to help the people cope, sometimes there's real hostility, either overt or, and I can think of a circumstance after the earthquake in San Francisco when the Navy was really, because of numbers, we had a lot of people and had about 2,000 Marines sent in to help as well. The leaders, the Navy leaders, the chief petty officers, the petty officers who were the real backbone of the crisis response, they had families that were also affected by the earthquake. The earth was still moving. We had, 500 aftershocks and so on. And so I learned a lot from that experience that you really do have to take care of the people who are sublimating their own personal fears and anxieties, maybe not taking care of their families because they're responding. So later on, a couple of years later, when the Northridge earthquake happened, I had recruiters in Northridge and in that part of Los Angeles, and I told the commanding officer of the recruiting district Los Angeles that I was going to request that Navy Medicine send in what we call a sprint team, which in those days, which was a kind of rapid response psychological support team to come in and help people deal with it. And she just was offended that, Admiral, you can't believe that my people are going to have any problems dealing with this. And I said, well, I think they will. You may not appreciate it, but I think they will. And so she was pretty aggravated at me. She read that as a lack of confidence in her leadership ability, and I was merely projecting my hardcore, hard lessons learned kind of experience from a similar kind of situation. So I think there, you've got to be sensitive to what the people are going through, and sometimes maybe even impose some support when they don't yet feel they're quite ready for it, but you know from your own experience that it's an important part of their coping over the long term with the circumstances of the situation.
Can I try just a...
Sure. Quick response, and then since we have a bunch of folks lined up, what we'll try to do is perhaps just have one response to each question so you all get a chance.
I wanted to have a chance to mention that a lot of times what you do before the crisis actually paves the way for much smoother operations. And I would say our military is becoming more and more aware of this, the more we respond. So we have in the Navy, we have these partnership stations where we're going out to developing countries, and we're working with country teams, other people in the interagency, to have a better idea of who are the decision makers on the ground, who runs the local economy, who are people of influence. Because when you go into somebody else's home, you really have to do your best to understand what their life is like and what it means to them. So we're really good at trotting off and imposing our best figured solution, but that may not be the solution that is required or sustainable by the population. And if you'd like to kind of get a really quick read about some very, very great anecdotes along those lines, read 3 Cups of Tea by Mortensen, about going into a village and sitting with the people and how long it took him to understand what it was going to cost them to receive his help.
I got that book for Christmas from a dear friend of mine who recommended it highly, and I have not had a chance to read it yet.
Oh, got it.
So it's on deck, at least in terms of my reading. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for your question.
Susanna Selnick from Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. So all those situations you all talked about involve real people and victims, and I know it's really easy to become personally attached to many of those people. And I was wondering, how do you find a balance between building those relationships and understanding what's really going on the ground level, but then also becoming detached from the situation so that you can just do your work without any sort of complications?
Yeah, I think Captain Jett is quick to the switch, and perhaps our physician also. But I'll let Captain Jett respond first.
From my experience after the Columbia accident, I mean, that's a perfect question because it was one area that I wasn't prepared for, and I think now I could have done probably a better job if I had been more prepared and someone had talked to me about this in advance. The first couple of weeks of our time was focused specifically on the recovery of the crew, and we wanted to find each crew member, and we instituted a policy where, like a military tradition, once we found one of the crew members, we of course escorted that crew member with an astronaut all the way back till they were at Barksdale Air Force Base. So this required a lot of astronauts in the field with the search teams, with the FBI response teams for weeks, and it was difficult. When you are recovering your friends, it wears on you, and I think the hours that we were working, we were typically up, before dawn and searching all day, and then back late, and so I was pretty good at recognizing when the stress level was getting to be pretty high on someone, especially on one of the astronauts that was involved, and I would send him home for a couple of days. Lufkin was, it's not that far north of Houston. You can drive in a couple hours, and so we rotated people out. But of course, I never rotated out, and after a while, I started to recognize in myself that I was having trouble, starting to have trouble emotionally dealing with the impact of the recovery. The way I recognized it in myself was once, we had the typical first week or so, we were in response mode. We were responding to calls and dispatching teams, and it was a little bit chaotic, but we gradually transformed into a much more organized process, and every day I would, at dawn, the teams would gather in a VFW hall outside of Hemphill, and I would stand up and talk to the teams that were going out to search that day, and we talked about what we found and where we thought we would be able to find someone. And I noticed I was having as the days went on, I was having a more difficult time getting through that talk without getting more emotional in my process. So I think not only as a leader do you have to recognize when you need to pull people out and rotate them, you need to be able to recognize it in yourself and have somebody fill in for you for a couple days, step back, and move away from it, especially if it involves something. And I'm sure troops in combat experience similar things. A certain amount of time on the front line, and you do need a break.
Okay, thank you. We're going to speed it up again quickly because I'd like to get all of your questions answered. We have about 15 or 16 minutes left. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Catherine Munson from Tufts University in Boston. My question is springboarding off of some of the other questions we've heard from today about the nature of cooperation between the civilian sector, the NGOs, and the military. So when we're looking at theaters such as Afghanistan, when we're looking at the success of the mission, the success of rebuilding an entire nation, focusing on this partnership, how can we as individuals here at this conference, as both civilian and military future leaders, take this nature of conflict that we're seeing now and transform that into an idea of cooperation? What proactive steps can we personally take to better that environment and that relationship in the future?
That's it's a fantastic question, and I'm not supposed to respond because I'm not on the panel, but all I'd like to do is tell you, at least from my perspective here as an academic at the Naval Academy and in support of the Navy's mission, is primarily we over time have noticed a deficiency in the cultural competency development model of officership. We teach officers to be great tacticians, establish high levels of intellectual acumen, physical fitness, proficiency, but how do we create an officer corps who can go into a battle space like Afghanistan and instantly be culturally competent? The answer is it's very, very difficult. We say, well, the School of Hard Knocks or on-the-job training, right? After 6 months in Afghanistan or Kabul, well, you'll figure out the customs and traditions. It's too late. You have to arrive ready to go. And we are just now launching within the Department of the Navy and the Department of Defense, more broadly defined, initiatives to try to develop that cultural competence. It requires language training, anthropology, cultural education, immersion training, teachings and expertise in ethnographic research, being able to go out in the field and understand why people do what they do and how they behave. That's just my initial response, and I'll allow the panel to respond perhaps more deeply, but I will mention that if you are pursuing, since you're at Tufts, if you're pursuing a career in the diplomatic corps, let's say, yep, you're shaking your head, I figured that was the case, you, as well as a uniformed officer, have to develop cultural competency. Have you done a study abroad?
Not yet.
Not yet, right? Okay, so that's why institutions of higher learning find it so valuable for students like you to at least spend one semester abroad developing this cultural competence. But perhaps one of the other panelists, please go ahead.
I actually did work with some NGOs in Afghanistan, and I was there for a year. But I will say that in the military, it's very easy for us to make a decision about how we think things should happen. And we're very implementation oriented. And we'd really like for everybody to fall in line behind us. And you have to do some very quick learning on the ground, especially as regards NGOs. And there's a difference between NGOs who are funded through grants by the U.S. and other NGOs who are there implementing their charters on the ground, and they may conflict with U.S. military goals and objectives. For example, right now, we have adopted a counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. Well, there are plenty of NGOs out there whose primary goal is to relieve suffering. And one of those is, international agency is the Red Cross, Red Crescent. And so you will work alongside an organization who will be giving medical kits to anyone who needs them, including the enemy. And you have to understand that that's going on. And there are other NGOs who are doing very good work and have long-standing relationships with communities that we can't even enter. And if you go to their work site, you will compromise them, and they will no longer be safe. And so it's a very, very hard coordination to try to have a complementary effort but not to destroy or disrupt the NGO's work, as they may be there and doing fantastic things among the population.
All right, in the interest of time, this young lady over here, please.
Allie Bentley from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, so go Big Red.
Go Big Red.
And I just want to take a second to say thank you all for coming. I'm sure we all appreciate it. My question focuses primarily on, as business students especially, we're always taught that with technological advancements and rapid globalization, it's not important to be first, it's important to be fast. How do you address that caveat of being fast and flexible against building rapport with those who are following you, that you make them not only want to follow you, but believe in following you?
In the interest of giving everyone an opportunity to participate, I suspect our physician oftentimes is faced every day with having to choose speed over quality, let's say, as something that might be compromised. Sir, would you like to respond? Sure.
That is a day-to-day challenge for me in an emergency department or anybody in an emergency department, because you have speed, you have patients in a waiting room that you want to bring back, you have patients with life-threatening conditions in which you need to treat quickly. So I think a lot of it, a lot of emergency medicine is a lot of what we're talking about today. It's turning chaos into control. And I guess my answer to that question is it's good that we have guidelines and protocols, and the more protocols and guidelines, the better, in the sense that patient comes in with a certain complaint or an issue, we sort of have a predisposed plan on dealing with these things that we can go through quickly. With that said, the danger is you have to be flexible, because medicine, not everybody reads the books, and it can come in with different conditions or different presentations. So I think you need to have the tools, you need to have the preparation, as we've talked about, and know what you're doing with the different cases and different volumes and so forth. But you have to have the flexibility as well that you can get off track when you need to. And you just have to be confident in your abilities and confident in your team, and make sure you have a good team. But what I do every day, it's quality and speed. And you can't do, you could be the best ER doc in the world, but if you're slow, you can't move a department. But if you're too fast, you make mistakes, and we all know what that happens. So there's a balance there.
That's the key word, balance. Finish with the word balance. Yes, sir, over here.
The question I have, well, Mike Drummond from Penn State. The question I have is, how do you make leadership transition as small a crisis as possible? I know it's easy to have allegiance to someone you know has earned your trust and has been there for a while. When you're an executive officer, you're not foreign to the organization. And particularly if an organization is damaged after a crisis, the leadership gets changed. How do you avoid rejection and gain the confidence of those you work with?
I suspect all of the panelists, because we're wise, sage, on in years, we've been through a lot of transitions with bosses. Anybody want to particularly respond, please?
I'll give you the short version because I just finished my doctoral dissertation on the topic. I studied the transition of leaders who arrived after the previous commanding officer had been fired. So this is really, really tough. And there are, of course, it's a broad spectrum of impact on the crew. Sometimes the crew is very, very reluctant to let the old leader go. Oftentimes the crew has a hand in some of the conditions that caused the removal of the previous commander. And some of these things are complicated by predictable factors like geography, isolation, operating with legacy systems, operating in some way that's different than another similar organization. And you get that identity that we have to start doing things a different way. And if people understood us really, they'd understand that we have to do things a different way. And what I saw all of the leaders do is, first of all, establish trust. And in the cases where the impact on the crew was most severe, they brought in somebody else, somebody they knew they could trust from outside, to expand their view so they could really see what's going on, so they wouldn't miss anything. And then they opened up communication. They talked at all levels, at the department head level, at the sub-department head level, at the crew level. And they started a dialogue, and they started formally communicating standards, the real standards, not the special standards that you had to have because you were stationed over here, or your deployment schedule, or your operational tempo was higher than everyone else's, the real standards. And then they walked the standards. And so a lot of times where you see a unit that fails because of material condition, what you see is that the captain is not inspecting the material condition of the ship. And so you've got to go and you've got to do it. You've got to personify and exemplify that standard. And so it's all about establishing trust, communicating standards, and walking the walk.
There's this irony in modern organizations that after a crisis, we replace the person at the top, which de facto causes another crisis. And these are matters that we've all dealt with before, and I think that's excellent advice. Lieutenant Saunders, I'm showing about quarter up. Do we have a time for one more, two more? Yes, sir, please do.
Admiral Brent W, member of the greatest generation. Tom Brokaw will tell us. I heard the word mentor once or twice. Let me tell you what happened to me. I'm a 25-year-old submarine officer growing up under four-class skippers saying, hey, I'm learning from this one, I'm learning that one. I'm comfortable that my leadership qualities are growing and I'll be successful. All of a sudden, my skipper ends up with a global battle problem and he's off to the hospital. And the powers that be said to me, you can train another skipper in this submarine, or you can take care of yourself. So, at age 26, out of the blue, I am the mentor. So my message to you is, while you're growing up, learn as quickly and as much as you can, because you never know when you're going to be the teacher.
Admiral Rinskoff, thank you so much for your contribution, and thanks so much on behalf of the class of 1938 for your generosity. Well, these seats are saved for you for years to come, please. Thank you. Thank you very much. This notion of moral courage is complicated because we have the ability now technologically to always ask somebody in a position of authority, responsibility. Most of you are wired to be able to always ask, and moral courage really relies on your ability to do in the absence of the opportunity to ask. I can remember Lieutenant Jett and Lieutenant Adamshick many, many years ago, back during the Cold War, getting 1,000 miles or so from the ship with nobody to ask. Nowadays, we have communication satellite systems that always allow us to ask. You have to be able to work in crises autonomously. That's when you lean on your moral courage. She didn't ask anybody. She got some advice. But she asked herself what was the right thing to do. So that's my teaching moment. We're back over here. Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. My name is Amber Kearney. I'm a student from Hampton University, William R. Leadership Institute. And my question is directed to Admiral Evans. You spoke a little bit about management, and crisis leadership. How do you determine when to use your crisis management skills over your leadership skills?
Well, the distinction, I was making it for illustrative purposes, but I think every day, whatever your role in the organization, your responsibility, you're accountable to try to make things better. Maybe it comes from my Girl Scout experience, make the world a better place. If you're not every day in the systems and processes that are happening around you that you're a part of, trying to make things better, you're not preparing your organization for better crisis management. So, you know, it's everything from your budgeting process, it's your deployment processes and procedures, it's your training processes. That's all of that kind of, you know, maybe that's the age-old question, where does management stop and leadership begin? I think they're totally intertwined, but I was trying to make the distinction of you know, those kind of categories that you can think about in supporting the operation that might unfold in a crisis situation.
I've been given the signal. We have one more young lady. If you could just make it a brief question, that's fine. The rest of you, please. Thank you so much. I'm sorry you didn't get a chance to answer your questions, but yes, ma'am. You get the final question.
Thank you. I'm officer candidate Karen Actel from North Carolina State University with the NROTC unit. And my question is, from being previously enlisted in the military, my question is, all the panel members talked about training. And I think you would all agree that in training, you wouldn't have carried out your crisis situation with your leadership skills the same way if you hadn't done training. And my question is how do you motivate your personnel, because we're all going to be leaders, if not at the end of this year, if not next year. How do you motivate your personnel to want to train and to train like it's the real thing and not go through the motions for things that they probably don't think are going to happen, like a fire or a flood? But how do you train them to carry out the day?
See, because I told you it was the last question, I was hoping you were going to ask something simple. Like, what time is lunch? Or what's the main course for lunch? You throw that big bomb out here 2 seconds before we got to finish. It's a difficult question. Perhaps we have time for one quick response. Captain Jett wants to respond.
Let me just respond to a piece of that question, and that is, how do you make training interesting and try to motivate people? The way we train for spaceflight at NASA is actually a pretty good example of that. For everything that happens during a mission, we have a set of rules called flight rules that are supposed to address every contingency and give the flight director who runs the team on the ground and the commander in space, you know, guidance to, if this, then do this. Those rules are extensive. There are books and there are volumes of them. Well, if all we did was train and follow the rules all the time, that would get very, very boring. So what are the training division within NASA, the way they keep training interesting for us is they constantly put us in scenarios where the rules don't apply. And they make us think outside of the rules. And that becomes very, very interesting and challenging. So even though we spend many, many hours training for a mission, since we are always put in situations where we can't follow the rules, where the plan doesn't work, and it forces us to think and think on our feet. One, we get better at it, and it allows us to identify who is really good at it and who isn't, and help them become better at that. So that's the one piece of advice I have on training.
And Captain Jett gets the last word. Thank you for your question, and Navy's going to beat North Carolina in lacrosse this year as you walk away. Okay. On behalf of all the panelists, I see they're all going to say thank you too, but let me say how much I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I appreciate your participation very much to each of the panelists.